The morning Nellie Holloway buried her husband, she walked back from the churchyard alone, picked up his axe from the woodpile, and split enough timber to last 3 weeks. And every soul in Cutter's Creek who watched her do it understood that she was not a woman who intended to be broken. That was 2 years ago, in the spring of 1878, and since then the town of Cutter's Creek, nestled in the hill country of central Texas, where the live oaks grew thick along the limestone ridges and the wind came down hot and relentless from the north in winter, had watched Nellie Holloway become something that people in those parts rarely saw in a woman, entirely sufficient unto herself. She was 31 years old, with dark auburn hair. She kept pinned severely at the back of her neck during working hours, and let fall loose and heavy to her shoulder blades only after the last lamp was lit and the door was bolted. Her hands were calloused, her forearms were corded with the kind of muscle that came from genuine labor rather than idle exercise, and her eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, a deep greenish brown that shifted in different lights, and that men who had looked into them too long often struggled afterward to describe with any precision. Her husband, Gerald Holloway, had been a decent man and a poor farmer. He had loved her sincerely and managed the land badly, and when a fever took him in March of 1876, he left her with 40 acres of Rocky Hill country soil, a mule named Reuben, a milk cow called Patience, 17 hens, a smokehouse that needed a new roof, and a daughter named Clara who was 6 years old and had her father's blonde hair and her mother's quiet, watchful eyes. What Gerald had not left her was debt, because he had been too earnest and too poor to have accumulated any, and what he had not left her was any expectation of rescue, because Nellie Holloway had been raised by a woman who had raised herself, and she understood in her bones that rescue was a thing you waited for only if you could afford the waiting. She could not, so she had learned the axe. She had learned it the way she learned everything, with a kind of furious, concentrated attention that was almost frightening to witness. The first week she raised blisters the size of nickels on both palms, and she wrapped them in torn muslin and kept splitting. The second week the blisters became calluses. By the third week her stroke was clean and true, the axe falling exactly where she wanted it to fall, the wood parting in 2 neat halves that tumbled off the stump with a sound like a single hard clap. She sharpened the axe herself every morning before dawn, before Clara woke, before the rooster made his declaration from the top of the fence post. She sat on the low bench beside the woodpile with the whetstone and the axe across her knees, and she drew the stone along the blade in long, measured strokes, and she watched the sky lighten over the ridge to the east, and she thought about what the day required of her, and she did not permit herself to think about anything else until the blade was sharp enough to shave the hair from her forearm, which was the test she used because her father had used it and his mother before him. The routine had become something sacred to her. Not a performance of strength for anyone else's benefit, but a private act of preparation, a daily renegotiation with the world in which she made plain to herself and to the morning and to whatever forces governed the business of living that she was ready, that she was not waiting, that she was, in every sense that mattered, awake. Cutter's Creek had a population of 312 people, 2 saloons, 1 church, a general store run by a man named Aldous Fitch who cheated on weights but was otherwise harmless, a livery stable, a small schoolhouse where Clara Holloway was currently the best reader in her class, a doctor who also pulled teeth, and a new sheriff named Elmore Bates who was 24 years old, wore his hat too low, and had not yet been tested by anything serious. It also had, as of the second week of April in 1880, a stranger. His name was Joseph Hawkins, and he rode into town on a big bay gelding named Duncan at about 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, when the dust on the main street was so thick it moved like something alive in the still hot air. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that suggested he had been in at least one fight he had not started. He wore a plain brown coat, worn at the elbows, and his boots were good quality but old, resoled at least twice, the kind of boots that told you a man had walked considerable distances and intended to walk more. He had a rifle in the scabbard on his saddle and a pistol at his hip, which in 1880 in Central Texas was not remarkable, and he had a look in his gray eyes that the woman behind the counter at Fitch's General Store later described to her sister as like a man who has seen something through to the end and is not entirely sure yet what comes next. He bought flour, salt, coffee, and 2 tins of peaches. He asked Aldous Fitch if there was any work to be had in the area, and Fitch told him that the Holloway place out on the Limestone Road had been advertising for seasonal help, but that most men didn't last a week there because the widow who ran the place was, in Fitch's precise and charitable words, particular. Joseph Hawkins paid for his supplies, loaded them into his saddlebag, and rode out toward the Limestone Road. Nellie saw him coming from 200 yards out because she was on the roof of the smokehouse with a hammer and a bag of shingles, which was the project for this particular Tuesday afternoon, and from the roof of the smokehouse she had an unobstructed view in every direction. She watched him come up the lane between the live oaks, a big man on a big horse moving at a walk, not in any hurry, taking in the place as he came, the fenced kitchen garden, the repaired barn, the whitewashed fence posts, the woodpile stacked higher and straighter than most men's woodpiles, and she watched him pull up at the edge of the yard and look at her on the roof, and she did not stop hammering. "Mrs. Holloway," he called up. "That is correct," she said, driving a nail home. "I heard in town you might be looking for help." "Seasonal," she said. "What's your name?" "Joseph Hawkins." "Where from?" "Most recently San Antonio, before that a ranch outside of Fredericksburg, before that I was with the 8th Cavalry out of Fort Concho, but that was some years ago." She drove another nail, aligned the next shingle, drove another nail. "Can you mend fence?" "Yes." "Can you handle a plow team?" "Yes." "Can you take direction without arguing every other sentence?" There was a pause that she found interesting because it suggested he was actually thinking about the question rather than just saying yes. "I can take direction," he said. "I might occasionally have a thought of my own." She looked down at him for the first time, really looked, taking in the bay horse, the worn boots, the straight way he sat in the saddle. 75 cents a day," she said. "You eat what I cook, you sleep in the barn, you start at first light, and you leave the whiskey in town if you have any. I have a 6-year-old daughter in this house, and I won't have drinking on this property." "I don't drink," he said. "Everyone says that. Some of us mean it." She considered him for another moment. Then she went back to her shingles. "There's a stall at the far end of the barn with a cot and a lantern. Supper is at 6. Don't be late." He was not late. He was, in fact, early, and she found him standing on the porch at 5 minutes to 6 with his hat in his hand, looking out at the last of the sunset over the ridge, and Clara was peering at him through the screen door with the frank, unself-conscious examination that 6-year-olds conduct upon strangers without any awareness that it might be considered rude. "That is Mr. Hawkins," Nellie told her daughter, carrying the pot of beans from the stove. "He is going to help on the farm for a while." "Stop staring." "I am not staring," Clara said. "I am observing." Joseph Hawkins made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, which he suppressed with visible effort. Nellie set the pot on the table and told Clara to wash her hands and told Joseph Hawkins to come inside. And he came in and hung his hat on the peg she indicated, and sat where she told him to sit and ate the beans and the cornbread and the side of salt pork that constituted supper. And he ate everything, and said that it was very good, which it was. Because Nellie Holloway was a genuinely excellent cook in the way that people who have cooked out of necessity every single day of their lives tend to become excellent at it. "Are you a cowboy?" Clara asked him over the beans. "I have done some cowboying," he said. "Yes." "Mama can split logs better than any cowboy I have ever seen," Clara said, with the certainty of someone who has never actually seen any other cowboy. "I do not doubt that," he said. Nellie watched him say it and noticed that he did not say it with condescension or with the particular brand of amusement that men used when they were really saying a woman with an axe is a charming and temporary novelty. He said it the same way he might have said that the beans were good, as a simple acknowledgement of a plain fact, with no decoration. She did not trust it yet, but she noted it. He was up before she was the next morning, which surprised her, because she was up before the rooster. She came out of the house in the gray pre-dawn with the axe and the whetstone, and found him already at the fence line on the east pasture with the post-hole digger, and a pile of new posts she had bought from the mill 2 weeks ago and not yet had the time to set. He had dug 3 holes before she even sat down on the bench. She sat down, laid the axe across her knees, picked up the whetstone, and began to sharpen. He came across the yard a little later for the bucket of water she kept near the pump, and he watched her with the whetstone for a moment, not staring, just taking in what he was seeing, and he said, "Can I do that for you?" She looked up. "No," she said, and went back to the blade. He filled the bucket, walked back to the fence line, and kept working. She had expected him to push. That was what men did when a woman said no to a small thing. They pushed, they explained, they suggested that they were only trying to be helpful. They implied that the refusal was itself a problem. Gerald had not been that kind of man, which was one of the things she had loved about him, but most men were. She had learned this the hard way in the 2 years since Gerald's death, when neighbors and storekeepers and the occasional passing stranger had all, in their various ways, attempted to explain to her what she needed and how they could provide it. But Joseph Hawkins simply walked back to the fence line and kept working, and Nellie drew the whetstone along the blade and watched the sky turn pink above the ridge and felt something small and cautious shift inside her, like a bird adjusting its position on a wire. She did not examine the feeling. She tested the blade against her forearm. The fine hairs lifted and separated cleanly, and she stood up and went to start the morning milking. The first week he set 40 feet of new fence, re-roofed the back section of the barn, cleared the irrigation ditch that ran from the creek to the kitchen garden, and rebuilt the gate on the south pasture that had been hanging crooked for 11 months because Nellie had not yet found a way to get to it in between everything else that needed doing. He worked without conversation, or rather, he worked without unnecessary conversation. He would say what needed saying about the work. He would answer if asked a question. And in the evenings when Clara demanded that he read aloud from her school primer, he read aloud from her school primer in a voice that was quieter and more careful than his daylight voice, as though the child had given him something he needed to be gentle with. On the 8th morning, he came across the yard for water again at the same time that Nellie sat with the axe and the whetstone, and he paused and watched for a moment, and he said, "Can I do that?" She looked up. "No." "All right," he said, and he took the bucket back to the fence line. On the 9th morning she made an error with the angle of the whetstone. She was tired. She had been up twice with Clara, who had a slight cough that Nellie was monitoring with the contained ferocity of a woman who had lost a husband to fever and understood precisely what small illnesses could become. And she ran the stone at the wrong angle and left a shallow burr on the edge that she had to work back out with 3 careful corrective strokes. Joseph Hawkins was not there to see it. He was already at the far end of the property, fixing the hinges on the barn's main door. She corrected the burr herself, and the blade came right, and she stood up and walked to the barn and told him the hinge on the left side needed to be reset a half-inch higher, or the door would still bind in winter when the wood swelled. He looked at the hinge. He looked at the door. He moved the hinge a half-inch higher without a word of argument. Clara's cough resolved itself in 3 days. Nellie slept properly again and was back to her standard precision with the whetstone. The days settled into something that had the texture of routine, but the undertow of something else, something that Nellie felt but did not yet name. She knew that he watched her sometimes in the way that a person watches a thing they are trying to understand, not with desire, not yet, or not in any way she was prepared to classify as desire, but with the kind of concentrated attention that she herself brought to things she was trying to learn. She noticed that he was meticulous about the property, that he did not cut corners, that when a job revealed itself to be larger than it had originally appeared, he simply absorbed the additional size of it and kept working. She noticed that he ate what she cooked with genuine appreciation and washed his own dishes in the bucket behind the barn and never left a mess for her to clean up. She noticed that he was kind to Reuben the mule, who was old and stubborn and had bitten 2 previous hired men badly enough to draw blood, but who allowed Joseph Hawkins to scratch the space between his ears with an expression that, on a mule's face, could only be described as grateful. She noticed all of these things, and she did not permit them to mean anything yet, because she had built her life on the principle that meaning was something you arrived at carefully and late, not early and easily, and she was not about to dismantle that principle for a man with good boots and a quiet way with a bad-tempered mule. 3 weeks after he arrived, on a Saturday morning in early May, she was sharpening the axe on the bench when he came across the yard and stood a few feet away, and she kept the stone moving in its long, even strokes, and she waited to see what he would say. "I was going to ask again if you'd let me do that," he said. She looked up. "Then I will save you the trouble." "No." "I figured," he said. He did not move to go. He stood with his thumbs in his belt and looked at the ridge for a moment, and then he said, "My grandmother used to do that. Sharpen the blade herself every morning, same time, same way. She said it was the only part of the day that belonged entirely to her." Nellie's hands slowed on the whetstone without her intending them to. She kept her expression even. "Your grandmother sounds like a sensible woman." "She was the most sensible person I have ever known," he said. "She ran a farm in Tennessee for 23 years after my grandfather died, raised 4 children on it, never asked a single person for anything she could do herself." Nellie looked at him. He was looking at the ridge, not at her, and she had the feeling that he was not telling her this story in order to accomplish anything in particular, that he was simply telling it because she had the axe in her lap and the whetstone in her hand, and he had remembered his grandmother. "What happened to her?" Nellie said. "She died at 78, he said. "In her own bed, in her own house, on her own land. I was 14. She told me the morning she died that she had no complaints, which I believe was the absolute truth." Nellie looked at the blade. She drew the stone along it once more. "You should get to the south irrigation ditch before noon," she said. "The water is moving slow. I think there is a blockage down near the creek bend." "I'll get to it," he said. He went. She sat for a moment longer than she needed to, her hands still, looking at the axe blade and thinking about a woman in Tennessee who had kept her own counsel and died satisfied in her own bed on her own land. And she felt something that was not quite grief and not quite recognition, but was something very close to both. The following Sunday was the one Sunday a month when Nellie took Clara to church in town, because she believed in education and moral instruction, but not in giving up 6 mornings a week to organized religion. And she left Joseph Hawkins a list of tasks for the day and hitched Patience, the cow's replacement, a stronger mare she had traded for the previous fall, to the wagon, and drove Clara the 4 miles into Cutter's Creek in her good dress, which was a dark green wool that was slightly too warm for May, but was the only dress she owned that was not also a work dress. In town she ran into her neighbor, Ruth Acker, who was 45 and had known Nellie since before Gerald died, and was one of perhaps 3 people in Cutter's Creek whose opinion Nellie genuinely valued. Ruth walked beside her after the service while Clara ran ahead to look at the horses tied outside the saloon. "I hear you have hired help," Ruth said. "A man from San Antonio." "From Fredericksburg most recently," Nellie said. "Previously San Antonio. He was with the 8th Cavalry before that." "8th Cavalry," Ruth said. "They were the Buffalo Soldiers, were they not? The colored regiment." "No," Nellie said. "That is the 9th and 10th. The 8th was a white regiment, although they served alongside both. He has mentioned Fort Concho. I have not asked him for details of his service. And he is a good worker." "He is an excellent worker," Nellie said, because it was true and she was not going to understate a true thing. The south fence has not looked that well maintained since the first year Gerald and I were on the property." Ruth glanced at her with the precise, measured look of a woman who has known another woman long enough to hear what is not being said. "And that is all you have to say about him. That is the relevant information," Nellie said. "Nellie." "Ruth." They looked at each other. Ruth smiled, which was a small smile and contained no victory, just warmth. "I am only saying," Ruth said, "that Gerald has been gone 2 years, and you are 31 years old, and you are one of the finest women in this county, and it would not be a betrayal of anything for you to notice a man who is worth noticing." "I notice him," Nellie said, with more honesty than she intended, and then she called to Clara to step away from the horses, and she walked to the wagon and climbed up and did not say anything more on the subject. But she thought about it on the drive back, with Clara chattering beside her about something that had happened at school, involving a spelling competition and a boy named Thomas who had misspelled the word necessary. And Nellie listened to her daughter and flicked the reins, and felt the warm May air against her face, and thought that Ruth Acker was, as usual, probably right, and that she, Nellie Holloway, was going to continue to be very careful anyway. Because careful was what had kept her upright for 2 years, and she was not ready to stop being careful. She arrived back at the farm in the early afternoon to find that Joseph Hawkins had cleared the irrigation blockage, repaired the section of fence she had not put on his list because she had forgotten it, and built a proper wooden step for the back door of the house, which had been missing its step for the entire 11 months she had been on this property because the original step had rotted and she had been using an upended crate and had gotten so accustomed to the crate that she had stopped thinking of the step as something that was absent. She stood and looked at the step. It was good, solid work. The boards fitted tightly, the whole thing level. She went to find him. He was at the pump washing the clay from his hands. "The step was not on the list," she said. "No," he agreed. "I did not ask for it." "No," he said, "but you have been stepping on a crate for 11 months and that crate has a cracked slat on the left side that is going to give way one of these mornings and drop you hard. I had the lumber in an hour." She looked at him. He looked back at her, undefensive, just watching. There was red clay on his forearms and a smear of it on his jaw, and his gray eyes in the afternoon light were the color of the limestone that jutted out of the hillsides along the ridge. "Thank you," she said. It cost her something to say it, not because she lacked gratitude, but because gratitude to him felt like the beginning of something she had not yet decided to begin. "You are welcome," he said, and went back to washing his hands and did not make anything of it at all. June arrived with heat that pressed down on the hill country like a hand, and the work of the farm intensified. The kitchen garden needed daily attention. The hay needed cutting and stacking. The creek level dropped and the irrigation ditch required constant management. Joseph Hawkins worked in the heat without complaint, coming in for supper each evening with his shirt dark and his hair damp, and the particular kind of worn clean tiredness on his face that came from having spent a day doing something real. In the evenings, he read to Clara. This had become a fixed point in the day, arrived at somehow without any formal arrangement, simply by the fact of Clara deciding one evening that he would read to her and handing him the book and him reading, and then the same thing happening the next evening and the evening after that. He read to her from a battered copy of Robin Hood that Nellie had saved for years from her own childhood, and from the school primer, and from the almanac when Clara demanded to know about weather patterns and crop cycles, questions the almanac answered with the kind of firm authority that Clara found deeply satisfying. Nellie sat in the chair on the other side of the room on these evenings, mending or sewing or working on the account book that recorded every cent the farm took in and paid out, and she listened to his voice as he read, and she watched her daughter's face in the lamplight, and she thought about how easy it was, and how easy was something she had not had for a very long time, and how she was not sure whether easy was something she should allow herself to trust. On the 21st of June, a hot Wednesday evening with thunder distant over the ridge, a man rode up the lane in the last light and knocked at the door, and when Nellie opened it she found Elmer Bates, the young sheriff, holding his hat and looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I am sorry to come at supper time. There is something I need to speak to you about." She stepped onto the porch, pulling the door partly shut behind her. "What is it?" "There have been some cattle missing from the Acker Ranch and the Pedersen Ranch," Bates said. "Small numbers, but steady. We believe it is someone working the area. I am going around to all the outlying properties to advise folks to keep their stock closer in and their eyes open." Nellie nodded. "Have you got any idea who is responsible?" "We have a description of a man seen near the Pedersen place 2 weeks ago," Bates said. "A big man, dark-haired, riding a bay horse." He paused. He looked at his hat. "I understand you have hired help. A man matching that description." Nellie looked at him steadily. "Mr. Hawkins has been on this property every day for 7 weeks," she said. "He has not been near the Pedersen place or the Acker Ranch. I know where he is every hour of every day because every hour of every day he is either in my sight or on work I assigned him that I can inspect and confirm was done." "Mrs. Holloway, I am not accusing. I know you are not," she said. "I am telling you what is true. If you want to come inside and ask Mr. Hawkins your questions directly, you are welcome to do so. I will stand here while you ask them, and I will tell you if anything he says does not match what I know." Bates came inside. He asked his questions. Joseph Hawkins answered them without agitation or defensiveness, with the calm of a man who has dealt with suspicion before and understands that the correct response to it is honesty delivered without drama. He told Bates where he had been and what he had done on each of the days in question, and Nellie confirmed each account, because she remembered, because she kept account of everything. Bates left satisfied and apologetic. Nellie closed the door and turned to find Joseph Hawkins still at the table, his coffee cup in his hands, looking at her. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I told him what is true," she said. "You went a step further than that. You stood in it with me." She met his eyes. "I am not in the habit of watching someone I know to be honest get treated as though they are not," she said. "It is a matter of simple accuracy." He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment something shifted between them that was different from the slow accumulation of the previous 7 weeks, something more direct. Then he looked at his coffee, and she turned back to the dishes, and Clara came in asking about the thunder, and the moment closed around itself and they went back to the ordinary evening. But that night, alone with the lamp turned low, Nellie sat with the account book open and the pencil in her hand and wrote nothing in it for a long time. She knew what was happening. She was not a woman who deceived herself. She had never had the luxury of it. She knew that the careful architecture of her self-sufficiency, the axe and the whetstone and the fence and the record-keeping and the early mornings and the late nights, had been built partly out of necessity and partly out of grief and partly out of the genuine satisfaction of competence, but that it had also been built, more recently, out of a decision not to need anyone again in the way that needing people opened you up to the specific pain of losing them. She also knew that Joseph Hawkins had not asked her to need him. He had not asked her to do anything except let him help with an axe blade, and she had said no twice, and he had accepted it both times and kept coming back and doing his work, and nowhere in 7 weeks had he made a single move that she could identify as a pressure. He was simply there, steady and warm and competent and quiet, and the steadiness of him was beginning to feel less like a fact about him, and more like a thing she was aware of in the way you are aware of a source of warmth when the day is cold. She closed the account book without writing anything and went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the thunder moving away over the ridge, and she told herself nothing definitive about what she intended to do, because she was Nellie Holloway and she made her decisions slowly and thoroughly and only once. The cattle thefts turned out to have been the work of a pair of drifters who were caught 2 weeks later near the Pedersen Ranch by the sheriff and 2 deputies, and Elmore Bates rode out to the farm to apologize personally to Joseph Hawkins, who accepted the apology simply, and without making the young sheriff feel worse than necessary, which Nellie observed and filed away as another piece of information about who this man was. July was brutal, the heat accumulating each day into a dry, baking pressure that made the air shimmer off the limestone outcrops and drove the animals to stand in whatever shade they could find by mid-morning. The work did not stop because the heat arrived. The work recalibrated. Earlier starts, a long pause at midday, a return to work in the late afternoon when the heat had some of the edge off it. On a Thursday morning in the middle of July, Nellie came to the bench with the axe and the whetstone and sat down, and it was already 90 degrees at 6 in the morning, and the sky was white with heat rather than blue, and she began the long, even strokes of the whetstone against the blade. Joseph Hawkins came across the yard at his usual time for the water bucket and paused at the pump and looked at her, and for the third time said, "Can I do that?" She looked up. She meant to say no. The word was entirely prepared, sitting at the front of her mind like a tool laid ready on a workbench. But what came out instead was, "Why?" He looked slightly surprised by the question, which she found interesting, because she suspected that men who offered to do things for women did not generally expect the offer to be interrogated. He took a moment, which she appreciated. "Because you have been doing it alone for 2 years," he said, "and I have been here 2 months and you are not alone anymore, and I think there might be some things it is all right to share, even for a person who does not need the help." She looked at him for a long moment. The whetstone was still in her hand. The axe was across her knees. The white sky pressed down on the whole of the hill country, and somewhere behind the barn Reuben, the mule was making his regular complaint about the heat. "Sit down, then," she said. He sat on the ground beside the bench, which was the only available space, crossing his legs under him, and she handed him the whetstone without further comment. He took it and looked at the blade and felt the edge with his thumb, reading where the metal needed work, and then he began to sharpen it, and he had the correct angle immediately, the stroke long and even and patient. She watched his hands. They were large hands, scarred in the way that working hands become scarred, with a particular callus on the right palm that came from rope work. He moved the stone with the same quality of attention she brought to it herself, not mechanical, not rushed, aware of the blade as something that deserved to be done right. "You have done this before," she said. "Grew up on a farm in Tennessee," he said. "A person learns." She thought of his grandmother keeping her own counsel in her own house, dying satisfied. She looked at his profile against the white sky. "Tell me about Fredericksburg," she said. "The ranch." He told her about it without romanticism or complaint. A large spread north of town, good cattle country, a fair owner, 2 years of steady work that had ended when the owner sold the ranch, and the new buyers brought their own crew from Abilene. He had come south after that into San Antonio briefly, looking for something he had not yet quite named. He had drifted, not in the aimless way, but in the deliberate way of a man working out a question he had not yet finished forming. "What is the question?" she asked. He looked at her. The whetstone paused. "Whether there is a piece of ground somewhere that is worth putting down roots in," he said. "Whether there is a life worth building rather than just working through." She held his gaze. And I do not know yet," he said, "but I am in less of a hurry about it than I was." She looked away first. He went back to the blade. They sat in the white morning heat in a silence that was not empty but full, the way silences are when they contain things not yet ready to be said. He handed the axe back to her when he was done. She tested the blade against her forearm. The hairs lifted cleanly and true. "It is well done," she said. "Good," he said. He stood, picked up the water bucket and went to the pump, and neither of them said anything more about it that day. But the next morning he came out with the whetstone before she sat down, and she sat down on the bench, and he sat on the ground beside it, and she handed him the axe, and they did not discuss it at all because it had become, in the way of things between two people who are paying attention to each other, simply what they did. Clara noticed everything, as she always did. One morning in early August she appeared on the porch while her mother sat on the bench and Joseph Hawkins sat on the ground beside it, and she looked at them both with the particular look she used when she was processing information, and she said, "Mr. Hawkins, are you going to stay here forever?" Nellie opened her mouth. Joseph Hawkins spoke first. "I do not know," he said, which was the honest answer. "I think you should," Clara said with the flat decisiveness of an 8-year-old who has arrived at a conclusion she considers complete. "You fixed the door and you read Robin Hood and you do not smell bad." She went back inside. Nellie looked straight ahead at the ridge. Joseph Hawkins handed her the axe. The blade was perfect. "She is very clear-eyed," he said. "She is," Nellie agreed. "She gets it from her father." Gerald could see a thing straight through in about 4 seconds when it took everyone else a week. It was the first time she had said Gerald's name to him, she realized. She had referred to my husband in various practical contexts, but she had not said his name. She felt Joseph Hawkins register this, not intrusively, just quietly. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," Joseph said. "He was," she said simply. "He was not a good farmer, but he was a very good man and he loved us completely. We were happy here. It is not a betrayal to say that, and also to say I have been very lonely since he died." She paused. She had not intended to say any of that. But she had, and it was true, and she was not going to unsay a true thing. "He would have liked you," she added. "He liked people who were straight with him." Joseph was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry you lost him," he said, not with the excessive sentiment that people offered about loss, that performative sorrow that always felt more about the speaker than the bereaved. He said it simply, meaning exactly what the words said. "Thank you," she said, and that was all. In August, Aldous Fitch came out to the farm with a document about the water rights on the creek that ran along the southern edge of the Holloway property. And it was a complicated and potentially troubling document, because it suggested that a land company out of Austin had been making claims on the water access in the county. And Nellie read it twice on the porch while Fitch stood sweating in his wagon, and she felt the familiar cold wash of threat that all small landowners in Texas felt in 1880 when Austin-based interests started making legal claims on things. "I need to talk to a lawyer," she said. "There is a lawyer in Kerrville," Fitch offered unhelpfully. "I know there is a lawyer in Kerrville," she said. "Thank you, Aldous." She took the document inside. She sat at the table with it. Joseph Hawkins came in for his midday water and saw her at the table with the papers and looked at her face, which she knew was not giving much away, but was giving something away to a person who had been paying attention for 3 months. "What is it?" he said. She told him. He sat down at the table without asking if he should, which she noted, and he asked to see the document, which she gave him, and he read it slowly, which she also noted because it told her he could read at a level above basic literacy, which was not universal among men who had spent their adult lives in ranch and cavalry work. "This is not as dangerous as it looks," he said. "The language is a standard form they use to open a claim, but there are water rights that predate this company's incorporation by 15 years in this county. If your deed is properly registered with the county recorder, and if Gerald registered the water access when you filed the land claim, then this is noise rather than a genuine threat." He looked up. "Do you have your deed?" "In the tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom," she said. He looked at her with something that she might have called admiration, except it was warmer than that. "Of course it is," he said. She retrieved the deed. He looked at it. The water access was properly registered, dated 1872, in Gerald's clear, careful hand. The land company's claim had no legal standing. "I will ride to Kerrville with you if you want a lawyer to confirm it," he said. "But I believe you are safe." "How do you know about water rights law?" she said. "I spent 3 months working for a land office in San Antonio," he said. "I hated every day of it, but I learned things. This is one of them." She looked at him. He had the deed in his hands and he was looking at her across the table, and the afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window and falling across the side of his face, and she thought with the clarity that sometimes arrives in ordinary moments. This is a man I trust. Not completely, not with everything, not yet, but with the deed, with the water rights, with Clara and the reading, with the axe blade in the morning. I would appreciate that, she said. The Kerrville trip. I'll look at the calendar and see when we can spare 2 days, he said, as though it were simply a matter of logistics, as though they managed the calendar together, which, she realized, they now essentially did. They rode to Kerrville in the second week of August. Clara stayed with Ruth Acker, who was glad to have her. The ride was 20 miles through hill country that in August was the color of straw and rust, the live oaks dusty, the creek beds running thin, the sky enormous and pale. They rode side by side on the limestone road and talked in the easy, ranging way that people talk when they have established enough of a common ground to walk around on it. He told her about the 8th Cavalry. Not about any violence. He stayed away from that with a deliberateness that she recognized as the deliberateness of a man who carries those things privately and does not unload them casually. But about the country it had taken him through, West Texas and southern New Mexico. The landscape he had found astonishing. The kind of big, austere, serious geography that a person either loves immediately or wants to leave and never return to. He had loved it. He had thought about it many times since. She told him about her family in Tennessee. A father who had been a blacksmith and a mother who had been a teacher, both dead of cholera in 1869 when she was 20, which was the worst year of her life until Gerald died, and she had come west with an aunt and uncle who settled near San Antonio, and she had met Gerald at a cattle auction in 1871, which was not a romantic venue but which had been the occasion of the most important conversation of her life up to that point. "He asked you what?" Joseph said. "He asked me what I thought of the stock," she said. "Most men at a cattle auction do not ask women what they think of the stock." I told him. He listened. We talked for 2 hours. His uncle found him and dragged him away, and Gerald looked back over his shoulder as he went, and I thought, that is someone who will look back. Joseph was quiet for a moment, riding. The road curved around a limestone bluff, and below them a dry creek bed gleamed white in the sun. "He was right to look back," he said. She did not respond to this directly. She watched the road, but she was aware of a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the August sun. The lawyer in Kerrville was a small, energetic man named Preston who confirmed everything Joseph had read in the deed, and wrote a brief letter to the land company that amounted to a politely worded legal dismissal. And Nellie paid his fee and they ate supper at the hotel dining room, which was the only place in Kerrville that served a proper meal. And it was the first time Nellie Holloway had sat across a table from a man in a dining room since Gerald was alive. She was aware of it. She suspected Joseph was aware of it. They talked about the farm and about Clara's schoolwork and about whether the rain, which the almanac suggested might arrive in September, would be sufficient to refill the creek to a useful level. And none of these subjects were romantic in any conventional sense. And she was aware the entire time of his hands on the table and his voice and the way he listened when she spoke, with his whole attention, the way some people listen and most people don't. On the ride home the next morning, about 5 miles out of Kerrville, her mare stumbled on a loose stone on the road and came up lame, not dangerously, but lame enough that Nellie dismounted and checked the hoof and found a bruised frog that needed to be walked out slowly. She looked at the 5 miles between her and the farm, and she looked at the mare, and she looked at Joseph Hawkins. "She needs to walk slowly," she said. "I know," he said. He dismounted Duncan, the big bay, and offered her the stirrup. "Ride with me, I will lead your mare." She looked at him for a moment. This was a practical suggestion with a practical solution, and she knew it. And she also knew that riding double with a man required a degree of physical proximity that was not quite what the previous weeks had contained. She was not a woman who made decisions based on fear, including the fear of her own feelings. She put her foot in the stirrup. He gave her his hand and she swung up behind him, and she settled behind the saddle on Duncan's broad rump with her hands at her sides, not holding on to him, which was not quite practical but was the position that felt manageable. They went about a quarter-mile before the road developed a considerable rut that caused Duncan to step sideways, and Nellie's arms came forward and caught his waist to keep her balance, and she left them there because it was sensible, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and they rode the remaining 4.5 miles to Cutter's Creek with her hands clasped against his stomach, and his horse moving easily under them and the hill country spread out in every direction, golden and immense, and indifferent to the two of them in it. When they reached the turnoff to the farm, he stopped to help her back to her own horse, whose lameness was already somewhat improved, and when she dismounted from Duncan and stood on the road beside him, she found that she was looking at him from a distance of about 2 feet and that neither of them moved to increase that distance immediately. "Thank you," she said, for the second time since he had come to the farm, and this time it cost her less, which told her something. "Any time," he said, and that was a different word than "you are welcome," a more forward-looking word, and she thought he knew that and she let it stand. September brought the rain. It came in on the 3rd of the month, a solid, drenching, generous rain that lasted for 2 days and filled the creek and turned the ground dark and brought the smell of the limestone hills up clean and sharp. And Nellie stood on the porch watching it fall with a cup of coffee in her hands, and felt the relief of the farmer who has been watching the sky for months. Joseph Hawkins stood beside her on the porch, also watching the rain, also with coffee, and Clara was in the house behind them working on a letter she was writing to an imaginary correspondent named Lady Anne, which was a game she had invented that Nellie found wholly charming. "I am going to stay," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the rain. "I made up my mind sometime in the last few weeks," he said, "and I want to tell you now because I do not want there to be any confusion about it. I am not staying because of the wages, although I am grateful for the work. I am staying because I have found the piece of ground I was looking for, and the person on it." He looked at her then. The rain came down into the yard and turned it to a fragrant red mud, and the creek behind the south pasture was audible from the porch, running full, and Nellie looked at him and he looked at her, and she felt the whole careful architecture of her 2 years of solitude shifting and resettling, not collapsing, just finding a new configuration. "I am not a woman who does things quickly," she said. "I know that," he said. "I have a child who is not yours and a property that is mine and a way of running my own life that I worked very hard to build and that I do not intend to dismantle." "I know all of that too," he said. "I am not asking you to dismantle anything. I am asking you to consider whether there is room in what you have built for someone who would very much like to be in it." She looked at his face. The rain came down. She thought about his grandmother in Tennessee. She thought about the whetstone in the mornings. She thought about the step he had built without being asked, the water rights he had read without being asked, the way he had sat in the Kerrville dining room and listened to her talk about Gerald Holloway with no jealousy, no competitive feeling, only the simple respect of a man who understood that a woman's past was part of who she was, not an obstacle. "I need more time," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not in a hurry." He went inside to refill his coffee and came back out with the pot and topped off her cup without asking, and they stood on the porch together and watched the rain fill up the world, and Nellie Holloway thought that she was, possibly, for the first time in 2 years, genuinely happy. The fall came on fast after the September rain, the way fall comes to the hill country, not gradually but all at once, with a sharp cold front that arrived one night in October and turned the live oaks overnight from summer green to something darker and more serious, and the pecans in the grove along the creek bent with their load, and the air had a bite in it that made the early mornings crystalline and cold. She still sharpened the axe every morning. He still sat beside the bench while she handed it to him, and he drew the whetstone in its long, even strokes, and she watched the sky lighten and they talked, or did not talk, in the easy way of people who have moved past the need to fill silence with noise and understand that some of the best things are said in the pauses. She taught him her method with the whetstone, the precise angle, the specific test against the forearm, not because he needed to be taught, he had a good instinct, but because she wanted him to know how she did it specifically, the way she had developed it and refined it, her own standard. He learned it exactly. He never argued with her on the angle. In November, Ruth Acker came to supper, which she did occasionally, and she sat across the table from Joseph Hawkins and watched the way he and Nellie moved in the kitchen together. The small, unconscious orchestration of two people who have learned where the other one stands. And she caught Nellie's eye over the bread she was cutting and smiled the small, warm smile. And this time it contained a small element of victory, and Nellie, to her own surprise, found that she did not mind. After supper, while Joseph was reading to Clara and Ruth and Nellie were washing dishes, Ruth said quietly, "He looks at you like you are something he could not have imagined." "That is a very elaborate way to describe a look," Nellie said. "It is an accurate way," Ruth said. Nellie did not disagree. On a cold Saturday in the last week of November, Nellie Holloway did a thing she had been considering for several weeks. She went to Gerald's grave in the churchyard in the early morning, before the town was fully awake, and she stood by the stone that said Gerald Arthur Holloway, beloved husband and father, 1841–1876, and she talked to him, which she had not done in some time. She told him about the farm and how the south fence looked better than ever and how the smokehouse roof had held through the September rain without a single leak. She told him about Clara's spelling and about the letter to Lady Anne and about the fact that his daughter could read at a level 3 years beyond her age, which he would have been absolutely delighted by. She told him about the water rights situation and how it had been resolved. And then she told him about Joseph Hawkins. She did it in the direct, undecorated way that she talked to Gerald when he was alive, which was the same way she talked to anyone she loved, without excess, without prettiness, with the full weight of the truth. She told him that this man had come to the farm and had worked hard and been honest and been kind to their daughter, and had sat beside her on the bench and sharpened the axe, and that she was trying to decide what that meant and whether she was ready. And she told him that she missed him, Gerald, still, and would always miss him, and that missing him and this other thing that was growing were not in opposition with each other. They were two separate true things that existed in her at the same time. And she needed to know if that was all right. The churchyard was cold and quiet, and the pecans had all dropped, and the sky above was a hard, brilliant blue. She stood for a long time. She walked home. She went directly to the barn where Joseph Hawkins was mending harness by lamplight, his big hands moving carefully through the leatherwork, and she stood in the barn doorway, and he looked up and saw her face and put the harness down and waited. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said in September, on the porch, during the rain." "So have I," he said. "I think," she said, and she felt the words forming with the deliberateness of someone choosing exactly the right tool for a precise job, "that there might be room for the person you mentioned in what I have built." He was still for a moment, and she watched his face change in the lamplight, something in it releasing, some held breath she had not known he was holding, and then he stood up and he was standing in front of her, and he said, "Nellie," just her name, just that. "Yes," she said. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, just the edge of his thumb along her jaw, and she let it happen, and then she stepped forward into the remaining space between them, and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his chest, and stood there in the lamplight in the cold barn while Reuben the mule regarded them from his stall with spectacular disinterest, and she breathed. She let herself breathe. Clara found out at breakfast. Nellie told her directly, as she told Clara everything, without sugar-coating but with warmth. She said that she and Mr. Hawkins had feelings for each other, and that nothing was certain yet about the future, but that she wanted Clara to know because Clara deserved to know. Clara ate her biscuit and thought about this for approximately 30 seconds. "Does that mean he is going to stay?" she said. "For now," Nellie said. Beyond that, we will see." "Good," Clara said, and ate another bite of biscuit and asked if there were more, and that was that. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was a cold one, cold enough that the creek froze at its edges in January for the first time in 5 years, and the farm settled into its winter rhythms. The woodpile, which was, this year, massive and expertly stacked because there were 2 people building it, and the evenings were long and lamplit, and Joseph moved from the barn into the house by mutual agreement in late December, into the room that had been Gerald's office and was now a bedroom. Because the barn was genuinely dangerous cold, and because there was no reason to pretend they were not something they clearly were, while also maintaining the proprieties that a small town and a small child and the year 1881 required. They were circumspect. They were careful. They were also, in the privacy of those winter evenings, beginning to discover the particular, irreplaceable pleasure of knowing that someone is glad to be in the same room as you, is watching the lamplight on your face, is listening to your voice when you read aloud, is reaching for your hand in the dark of a cold night without either of you making a decision about it, just a hand reaching and being met. In February, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the morning, on the bench by the woodpile, sitting on the ground beside her, the whetstone in his hand, the axe across her knees. He had been sharpening the blade for about 10 minutes in the good silence they had cultivated between them, and he stopped and held the axe still and looked at her and said, "Nellie, I would like to marry you. I would like to stay on this land and build this life and be Clara's father if she will have me. I want to know if you will have me too." She looked at him. The February morning was clear and cold, the ridge showing through the bare branches of the pecans, the sky a winter blue. She thought of the first morning she had said no to him, and the second morning she had said no, and the morning she had said why instead, and the way he had sat down on the ground without any wounded feeling and begun to help. She thought of Ruth Acker's face, full of warm certainty. She thought of Gerald's grave in the churchyard and the cold blue sky over it and the peace she had felt walking home. "Yes," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her, there on the bench in the February morning, with the whetstone in his hand and the axe between them. And she kissed him back, and it tasted like cold air and coffee and the particular sweetness of something that has been arrived at rightly. And she thought she had never been kissed in a moment that contained more of who she was, all of it. The work and the grief and the sharpened blade and the well-mended fence and the child inside the house, who was at this very moment writing another letter to Lady Anne, and she was not afraid of any of it. They married in March of 1881, on a Wednesday because Nellie refused to give up her Saturday work rhythm, in the church in Cutter's Creek, with the minister she had selected on the basis of him being the one she found least patronizing, which was a low bar, but he cleared it. Ruth Acker stood with her. Aldous Fitch was there, and the doctor, and the schoolteacher, and about 60 other people from the town and the surrounding properties because Nellie Holloway was not a woman people failed to show up for. Clara, who was now 8 years old and wearing a dress that Nellie had made from the good blue fabric she had been saving for 2 years, walked beside her mother down the aisle with the solemnity of someone who understands they are performing an important function, and she looked at Joseph Hawkins waiting at the front of the church and gave him the small, decisive nod of a person completing a transaction they had already internally approved. He smiled, the kind of smile that comes from very deep in the chest. The ceremony was short and clear, and the words were the old words, simple and true, and Nellie said them without hesitation, her voice steady, her hand steady, looking at Joseph Hawkins and meaning every syllable, and he said them back to her in that quiet voice of his, the one she had first heard reading Robin Hood to her daughter in the lamplight, and when the minister said it was done she did not cry. Because she was Nellie Holloway and she had built a life with her own hands, and she was not crying at the consummation of that life, she was just breathing it in and being grateful. Ruth Acker, however, cried enough for both of them. The spring of 1881 came on green and generous after the cold winter, and the farm transformed in a way that still sometimes caught Nellie by surprise, not because of any dramatic change, but because of the specific quality of ease that came from having two skilled people working toward the same goal. They were not the same kind of farmer, she and Joseph. She was more systematic, he was more intuitive, and they had lively debates about certain questions of crop rotation and irrigation, timing that neither of them ever fully won, which was in itself a pleasure she had not expected, the pleasure of being argued with by someone who respected you enough to argue honestly. He learned, over time, the full range of her methods, and she learned his. And what they built together was something neither of them could have built separately, which is the thing that good marriages do, and is what she had had with Gerald in a different register, and what she had now with Joseph in this one. And she held both things at once as two separate true things and was not confused by it. Clara, for her part, bloomed in the way that children bloom when they feel safe, which she had always been safe, but now was also not working so hard to be independent in the way that the children of working widows sometimes learn to be independent too early and too completely. She began calling Joseph Pa, which happened one morning in April with no discussion or lead-up. She simply said it at breakfast, and he went very still for a moment and then said, "Yes," in a voice that was not entirely level, and Clara said could she please have more eggs, and that was how that was settled. In the summer of 1881, Nellie told him she was with child. She told him in the evening, with Clara already asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the account book between them, which was not a romantic setting, but which was where they spent their evenings when the practical business of the farm needed attention. And she told him simply, because she did everything simply, and she watched his face. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at her, and she saw in his face something she had not quite seen before, a kind of awe, the particular awe of a man confronting a happiness he did not know how to be large enough to contain. "Nellie," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hands in his, the account book between them with its neat columns of figures, and he held her hands and did not say anything for a while, and she let him not say anything because she understood that some things needed a moment to settle before they became words. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Are you pleased?" he said. "I am very pleased," she said. And she was, and the simplicity of being pleased, the uncomplicated joy of it, was itself a kind of gift she had not expected from the future. Their son was born in February of 1882, which made him a winter baby, born in the cold and the blue light, and they named him Arthur Gerald Hawkins, Arthur for Joseph's grandfather in Tennessee, and Gerald for the man who had been on this land first, and who would always be a part of what the land held. The name was Nellie's idea, and Joseph received it with the same quiet gravity with which he received everything important. Arthur was a loud, red-faced, determined baby who announced himself to the world with considerable force, and who by 2 months was already lifting his head with the focused intensity of someone who intended to get somewhere. He had Joseph's dark hair and Nellie's creekwater eyes and Clara's precise, observational frown, all of which made him an extremely entertaining person to share a house with. Clara was 11 by the time Arthur arrived, and she was both genuinely delighted by him and periodically exhausted by him, which is the correct and balanced response to a baby brother. She read to him in the evenings with the same earnest seriousness that Joseph had once read to her, which moved Nellie in a way she could not quite name, the continuation of the thing, the passed-down gentleness. The farm by 1882 was in the best shape it had ever been in. The fence lines were all tight, and the smokehouse had a new roof over the new roof, and the irrigation system had been extended to reach the north field, which Joseph had cleared and broken and planted with a section of winter wheat that had come in strong. They were not rich. No one farming 40 acres of hill country limestone was going to be rich in 1882, but they were stable, which was the next best thing to rich, and in many ways better, because stability in 1882 in Texas was something you built with your hands and your attention, and your refusal to be beaten by the thousand small catastrophes that the land and the weather and the markets conspired to throw at you. Nellie still sharpened the axe every morning. She did it alone now, some mornings, the way she had always done it, sitting on the bench in the early dark with the whetstone and the blade and the slow lightening of the sky. And other mornings, Joseph sat beside her, and she handed him the axe and he sharpened it in her exact method, with her exact angle, because he had learned it and it was hers, and he kept it as it was, unchanged, which she understood as a form of respect so precise she could not have asked for it if she had tried. On a morning in the spring of 1883, when Arthur was 14 months old and pulling himself upright against every piece of furniture in the house with the grim determination of someone on a mission, Nellie sat on the bench in the early April morning with the whetstone and the axe, and the air smelled of new grass and cedar and the creek running full again after a good wet march, and she looked at the ridge to the east where the sky was doing what it did in April, turning from dark blue to the most extravagant pink she had ever seen, a color that no sensible woman should permit herself to be moved by, but that Nellie found, every single April, moving. Joseph came out of the house and sat on the ground beside her, and she handed him the axe without looking away from the ridge, and he took it and sat the whetstone to the blade, and the sound it made was the exact right sound, the sound she had listened to every morning for 5 years, first alone and then with him, and he was drawing the stone in her method, her angle, her long, even patient strokes. And the sky was going pink over the ridge, and the creek was running full behind the south pasture, and inside the house Arthur was beginning to make his wake-up sounds, the preliminary announcements that preceded the full declaration, and Clara was probably already awake with a book. She was always already awake with a book. "Good morning," he said without looking up from the blade. "Good morning," she said. He sharpened. She watched the ridge. The pink deepened. The rooster made his declaration. Arthur's preliminary sounds became more specific. Reuben the mule, 14 years old and increasingly dignified in his complaints, made his regular observation from the barn. She tested the blade when he handed it back. The hairs on her forearm lifted cleanly and true. "Perfect," she said. He stood up and brushed the clay off his pants and looked at the sky with her for a moment, the two of them side by side at the bench in the pink morning light, and she was aware of him beside her the way she was aware of the ground under her feet, which is to say, completely and without the need to think about it. Inside, Arthur's announcements became full and loud and requiring attention. Clara's voice could be heard, reading something aloud to him to buy another 5 minutes, which worked on Arthur about half the time. Nellie set the axe against the bench. She looked at Joseph. He was looking at the ridge, the last of the pink light gilding the limestone white, his face in profile, the face she had been looking at for 3 years now with the particular knowledge of someone who has looked at a face long enough to see all the different things in it at different times of day. "Ruth is coming to supper Saturday," she said. "I know," he said. "She told me at the store. She is bringing the apple preserves she made in the fall." "She told you at the store," Nellie said. "She wanted to make sure I was prepared," he said, straight-faced, because Ruth Acker in full social mode required some preparation. Nellie laughed. She did not laugh the way she had laughed before Gerald died, easily and often, not the same laugh, but this laugh was its own thing. It had come back in its own shape after its own absence, and it was real, and it was hers. Arthur's voice from inside reached its decisive peak, which was the sound of a small person who had run out of patience with the preliminary business of the day and required his mother immediately. Clara's reading voice reached its coda. Nellie picked up the axe. She leaned it against the woodpile where it lived, balanced perfectly against the stack, handle at the angle she preferred, ready for the day's use. She straightened and looked at her husband. He looked back at her, and his eyes in the morning light were gray as the limestone of the ridge, and there was in them the same thing she had seen since November of 1880 when she had told him there was room. That same look of a man who has been given something he did not entirely believe was possible and has chosen, every single day, not to take it for granted. She went inside to her son. He came behind her, his hand at the small of her back for just a moment as they passed through the door, the lightest pressure just there and then gone, just enough. By the summer of 1883, Nellie had discovered she was expecting again, and this time the news settled on her differently, not with the slightly cautious joy of the first time, but with a deep, uncomplicated warmth, the warmth of someone who has arrived somewhere and knows it. Joseph received it with the same warmth, and Arthur, when this was eventually explained to him in terms a 16-month-old could absorb, received it with absolute incomprehension but considerable enthusiasm for the attention the conversation was generating. Their second child was born in January of 1884, a daughter they named Frances, after Joseph's grandmother in Tennessee, the woman who had sharpened her own blade and run her own farm and died satisfied in her own house. Nellie had suggested the name. Joseph had been unable to speak for a moment when she did. Frances arrived loud and red and certain, like her brother, but smaller and with a look in her eyes, right from the beginning, that Clara described as extremely determined, which was the Holloway Hawkins family's highest compliment. The house was full now in the way that houses are full when they are working as they are meant to work. The noise of children and animals and cooking, and the low conversation of two people who have enough to talk about and enough silence between them, and know the difference between when you need the one and when you need the other. The injustice of the land company's claims, which had not ended with the August dismissal of 1880, but had circled back in different forms over the years, was a constant background pressure that every small landowner in hill country felt. Nellie had watched neighbors lose properties to legal technicalities, and to violence, and to the slow starvation of credit terms that no farming operation could survive, and she had kept her own deed in its tin box under the floorboard, and she had kept her accounts scrupulous and current, and she had paid every debt within 30 days of incurring it, and she had extended her water rights registration at the county office every year as required. And when the land company's lawyers came around again in 1883 with a revised claim, she walked into the county recorder's office in Careville with her deed and her records and Joseph beside her and Preston the lawyer, who now knew their case so well. He could cite the relevant statutes from memory, and the claim was dismissed again, formally and finally, with a written notation in the county record that made future claims of the same type impossible. Walking out of the county recorder's office into the Careville sunshine, Joseph looked at her and said, "I believe that is the last of it." "I believe so too," she said, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a thing that has been fought for and won enclosed, a door shut firmly and latched. They ate a celebratory lunch at the hotel dining room, the same dining room where they had eaten in August of 1880, except that this time there was no pretense, no careful distance. There was just two people who were married and had 2 children at home with Ruth Acker, and who were taking a Monday afternoon to mark the end of a 3-year legal irritation with a proper meal. And they talked about Frances and about Arthur, and about the new section of the kitchen garden that Nellie wanted to expand, and about whether they should look at getting a second mule to replace Reuben, who was very old now and who moved with the dignity of extreme age and should not, at this point, be asked to do anything too demanding. "He deserves his retirement," Nellie said. "He has earned it," Joseph agreed. Reuben died that fall peacefully in his stall of old age and apparent contentment, which Nellie felt was exactly the right way to go if one had the option, and they got a new mule from the Pedersen ranch, a young brown animal with more energy than he knew what to do with, who required several months of patient handling before he was useful. Joseph handled him patiently. Arthur, at 2.5, was fascinated by him, and had to be kept at a careful distance until the mule had settled into his proper temperament. By 1885, Clara was 15 years old and at the top of her class in the Cutter's Creek School and had developed a passionate interest in medicine, sparked by a visit from the county doctor, who had come to treat Arthur's croup the previous winter, and who had answered all of Clara's precise and difficult questions with the genuine respect due an intelligent person, rather than the dismissive condescension due a girl, and Nellie had noticed this and been grateful for it. And she had also noticed Clara's aptitude and had begun, very quietly, to look into what the possibilities were for a young woman who wanted to study medicine in Texas in 1885, which were limited but not, she had determined, entirely non-existent. She talked to Joseph about this one evening, the children asleep, the account book on the table, the lamp burning low, and he listened to her in the way he always listened, with his whole attention. And when she finished, he said, "What does Clara want?" "I have not asked her yet," Nellie said. "I wanted to know what I thought about it first." "And what do you think?" "I think," Nellie said, "that she is Gerald's daughter and mine, and that we are not people who decide what a person can and cannot do based on things that have nothing to do with their capability, and that if she wants to study medicine, she should study medicine, and that we will find a way to make that possible." Joseph looked at her across the table. "I agree," he said. She looked back at him. "That is all. That is all," he said. "You have thought it through. I agree with your conclusion." She was quiet for a moment. "You know," she said, "sometimes I am still surprised by you." "How so?" "By the absence of argument where other men would insert argument." He considered this. "I have opinions," he said. "I am not without opinions. But you were right about the irrigation timing in September, and you were right about the fence posts in the north section, and you were right about the water rights case, and you are right about Clara. I am not going to argue with correct." She looked at him for a long moment, and what she felt was something that had no single word for it, some compound of love and gratitude and the specific pleasure of being known, of being seen correctly and completely. And she thought that this was what she had not known she was looking for in the years between Gerald's death and that September morning on the porch in the rain, this precise quality of being known. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Thank you," she said, and this time it cost nothing at all. He turned his hand and held hers. The lamp burned. Outside the window the hill country night was enormous and cold and full of stars. They talked to Clara about medicine the following Saturday, at the kitchen table after supper, and Clara received the information that her parents were willing to look into possibilities for her with the controlled, focused intensity of someone who had been hoping for exactly this conversation and had been too afraid to ask for it. She asked 3 precise questions about what Nellie had found out. She listened to the answers. She said she wanted to try. "Then you will try," Nellie said. "It will be difficult," Clara said. "They do not generally educate women as doctors." "No," Nellie agreed. "They do not generally educate women in many things they are capable of." That has not always stopped the women. Clara looked at her mother. She looked at Joseph. She looked at her own hands on the table, which were, at 15, her mother's hands in miniature, narrow and strong, already beginning to show the competence that came from being raised in a working house. "All right," she said. "Then I will try." Arthur, who was 3 and had been following none of this but could tell that it was important, said "all right," very firmly in a voice that was an almost perfect imitation of his sister. And Frances, who was a year old and sitting on Joseph's lap, reached for the bread on the table with the single-minded focus that characterized her approach to all problems. And Nellie looked at the 4 of them in the lamplight of the kitchen, her table, her children, her husband, her land, and she felt the specific, complete happiness of a woman who has built something real with her hands and her mind and her stubbornness and her heart, and who is now, on an ordinary Saturday evening, sitting inside it. In the spring of 1886, they added a proper parlor to the house, which was the room Nellie had wanted since she had first arrived on the property, and which had been perpetually deferred by more urgent needs. But the farm was solid now, and the accounts were in good order, and there was a small surplus that justified the lumber. And Joseph and a carpenter from town built the room together in 4 weeks that spring. And when it was done, it had 3 windows that looked out toward the ridge, and a stone fireplace that drew cleanly, and a floor of smooth wide boards that Nellie finished with oil until they gleamed. She put Gerald's rocking chair in the corner by the east window. She put the new chair Joseph had made for her birthday in February on the other side of the fireplace. She put Clara's books on the shelf Joseph had built into the south wall, and Arthur's wooden horse on the floor near the hearth, and Francis's blanket on the window seat. She stood in the finished room on the afternoon they completed it, looking at all of it, the late spring light coming through the 3 new windows, and Joseph stood in the doorway behind her. "It is exactly right," he said. "It is," she said. She turned around. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking at her, and she walked to him, and he unfolded his arms and she stepped into them, and they stood in the doorway of the new parlor of the house that was theirs in every sense that mattered. And the hill country spring was brilliant outside the windows, and somewhere in the yard Arthur was making the particular sound that preceded either a great discovery or a fall into something muddy. And Clara's voice answered him with the patient authority of a 15-year-old who has appointed herself her brother's primary supervision. And Francis was in her basket in the kitchen, making the contented sounds of a baby who has recently eaten. "I love you," Nellie said against his chest. She had said it before. She was not sparing with it. She believed in saying true things, but each time she said it, it was new in the way that true things are always new when you say them to the right person. "I love you," he said, "in ways I did not know I was capable of before you." She pulled back and looked at him. "Before me, you had not yet been asked to rebuild an irrigation ditch and argue about fence post depth and read Robin Hood aloud for 40 consecutive evenings." "Those things," he said, "are exactly what I mean." She laughed. The laugh was full and real and entirely her own. By the end of 1886, Clara had been accepted by correspondence to a nursing education program in San Antonio that had begun, tentatively and with considerable institutional resistance, accepting female students with the eventual goal of medical training. It was not the direct path to doctoring that Clara wanted, but it was a beginning, and Nellie had learned that beginnings were often disguised as limitations, and that the way through was to take the beginning and then keep going. Clara left in January of 1887. The morning she left, she and Nellie stood in the yard in the cold blue light, the wagon loaded, the horses patient, and Nellie held her daughter and then let her go and said, "You have everything you need inside you. The school is just the sharpening." Clara looked at her. She understood the reference. "Like the axe," she said. "Like the axe," Nellie said. Clara kissed her and kissed Arthur, who was nearly 6 and crying with a totality that only 6-year-olds can achieve, and kissed Francis, who was 3 and not entirely sure what was happening but was crying in solidarity with Arthur. And she shook Joseph's hand, and then, after a moment, she hugged him, quickly, tightly, the hug of someone who has decided something. And she climbed up to the seat of the wagon beside the driver, and she did not look back. Because she was Nellie Holloway's daughter, and she was going somewhere. The yard was quiet after the wagon turned at the end of the lane and was gone, just the sound of Arthur's diminishing grief and Francis's diminishing solidarity grief and the wind off the ridge and the creek behind the south pasture. Joseph came to stand beside Nellie. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. They watched the lane for another moment, the empty lane between the live oaks, and then she took a breath. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. Arthur composed himself with the speed that very young children have, grief to curiosity, in about 90 seconds, and he wanted to know if he could have eggs for breakfast, and whether the new mule was going to be used today, and whether Pa had seen the particular interesting rock he had found yesterday by the creek. All of those things, Joseph told him. Yes. Francis reached up for Nellie's hand. Nellie took it. They went inside, all four of them, into the warm kitchen, into the morning that was already beginning its ordinary course. The stove to light, the eggs to fry, the mule to harness, the work to do. The parlor windows caught the winter light, and the Gerald's rocking chair sat in its corner by the east window, and Frances's blanket was on the window seat, and the house held all of it, the past and the present and the beginning of what the future was going to be, and there was room in it, Nellie thought. There was room for all of it. She lit the stove. Joseph set the coffee on. Arthur found his interesting rock on the windowsill where he had apparently left it the day before, and presented it to Frances with the magnanimity of a prince granting a gift, and Frances accepted it with the gravity of a person who will take all presents seriously and examine them fully, and Nellie watched her children in the morning light of her kitchen and thought, This is the thing. This specific accumulation of ordinary days, each one built on the last, each morning the whetstone on the blade, each evening the lamp and the table and the voice reading aloud, each season's work carried into the next season's work, each small ordinary love, the step built without asking, the hand held across the table, the name said in the barn by lamplight, the hug at the wagon that said everything the girl had not quite known how to say, each of these things fitting into the next thing, the way well-fitted boards fit into a floor, the whole of it stronger than any of the parts, and the whole of it theirs. She looked at Joseph across the kitchen. He was pouring the coffee, unhurried, and he glanced up and met her eyes, and he smiled, not the large smile of a formal occasion, but the small one, the private one, the one that she knew was only hers. She smiled back. Outside, the hill country morning opened itself up in all directions, the ridge and the creek and the live oaks and the limestone white in the winter sun, and the farm, the 40 acres of rocky, difficult, beloved land that Gerald Holloway had bought and loved badly and left to her, that she had held onto with her own 2 hands and her whetstone and her will and her refusal to be broken, and that she had then, with great deliberateness and great care, opened to a man who understood that a woman's axe was her own to sharpen. She picked up her coffee cup. The morning was waiting. The axe was sharp and ready by the woodpile where she had leaned it an hour ago, the blade perfect, the handle balanced just right. There was work to do, good work, the kind that was worth doing, and she had everything she needed to do it. She stepped out onto the back porch, onto the good solid step, and she looked at the ridge. 39 years old, 2 children in the house behind her, one on her way to becoming a doctor in her own fashion, in her own time. A husband who would sit on the ground beside her bench in any weather to hold the whetstone at the right angle, a mule who had never bit him, a creek running full after a wet winter, a parlor with 3 windows and a stone fireplace, and Gerald's chair in the corner and her chair across from it, both of them permanent, both of them right. She breathed the cold morning air in and breathed it out and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way you do when you have arrived somewhere worth arriving at. Joseph appeared in the doorway behind her with his own coffee, and he stood on the step beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and they looked at the ridge together. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. The rooster made his declaration. Somewhere to the east, the sun came up over the ridge in the full, plain way of a February sun in the Texas hill country, without ceremony, without excess, just light, coming as it always came, steady and reliable, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow, and enough. More than enough. Everything, in fact, that she had ever needed.